Unearthed in Savannah, The Forbidden Lessons of Elizabeth Thornton. Welcome to one of the most unsettling and mysterious stories ever told in the city of Savannah, Georgia. The year was 1839, when Savannah was still called the Jewel of the South. The streets shimmered beneath the weight of time, lined with massive oak trees draped in long veils of Spanish moss. Their shadows moved slowly across the cobblestone paths, as if they carried the memories of all who had walked there before. The air was warm and heavy, always damp, and it carried whispers from one grand home to another, from the polished porches on Abercorn Street to the quiet servant quarters hidden behind them. It began with something small, a short notice printed in the Savannah Morning Republican on April 3, 1839. It was the kind of announcement a reader could easily skip over. A marriage license had been issued to a widow, Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, aged 42, and to a man named James Bennett, aged 26. A simple piece of news on paper, yet behind those few words lay a scandal that would shake Savannah's finest families and uncover secrets that polite society had worked for decades to bury. For what the notice didn't say was that James Bennett had, until only recently, been considered property, not a man, but a slave belonging to the Thornton estate. Elizabeth Thornton, born Elizabeth Montgomery, was a woman of stature, belonging to one of Georgia's oldest and wealthiest families. Her grandfather had come to the colony in 1733 alongside General Oglethorpe himself. Through generations, the Montgomerys had built vast wealth from their rice plantations along the Savannah River, wealth born from the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people. Elizabeth was raised among privilege within the walls of her family's grand three-story mansion overlooking Reynolds Square. Parish records from Christ Church Episcopal show that at 17 she married Richard Thornton, a widower 28 years older than her, a man who owned a sprawling cotton plantation on the edge of the city. Their union was not simply a marriage, it was a merging of two dynasties, the Montgomerys and the Thorntons, two names that carried power from Savannah to Charleston. Richard's first wife had died in childbirth, leaving him a son, William, who was only 5 years younger than his new stepmother. The Thornton plantation was known for its order and silence. According to the diary of Mary Benny, Elizabeth's cousin, who visited in the summer of 1826, the household ran with clockwork precision. She described Elizabeth as delicate in appearance but commanding in spirit, a woman who ruled her servants with quiet authority and maintained an almost rigid routine. Richard, by contrast, spoke little. When he did, a hush always followed, as though even the walls were listening. He traveled often, to Charleston, to Augusta, leaving Elizabeth in charge of everything that mattered. It was during those long absences that few noticed how often Elizabeth was seen in the company of a house servant named Grace. Grace appeared in the household records in 1822, purchased from a trader in Charleston. She had not come alone. With her was her young son, a boy of 9 named James. By 1835, the tax documents of Chatham County listed 47 enslaved individuals living on the Thornton property. Most were assigned to field labor, their identities erased, their names replaced with numbers in the plantation ledgers. But James Bennett's name appeared again and again in household accounts, at first as Grace's boy, then as simply James, and later as James Bennett. The appearance of a surname was rare, and for historians, deeply intriguing. Dr. Eleanor Hammond, a researcher who examined the Thornton papers in 1963 before they mysteriously vanished from the Georgia Historical Society archives, noted something even more remarkable. James had been taught to read and write, a fact almost unheard of for a slave in that era. In her manuscript Whispers from Reynolds Square, Hammond wrote that plantation ledgers showed purchases of slates, pencils, and reading primers specifically for JB's instruction. The entries suggested that Elizabeth herself had overseen the lessons. When Richard Thornton succumbed to the yellow fever outbreak of 1836, his death altered the balance of everything. His will left the entirety of his property to Elizabeth, with a significant portion set aside for his son, William. Yet one particular clause stood out. It read, "The servant James Bennet shall remain in the employment of my wife, and shall not be sold or transferred under any circumstances." That single line would later become the center of a heated legal battle and a moral storm that no one could contain. Elizabeth wore black for exactly 1 year, observing the proper mourning customs. During that time, life on the estate continued as smoothly as ever. The fields were tended, the accounts balanced, and the servants followed her command. But the neighbors began to notice something they could not quite explain. Margaret Habersham, a close neighbor, would later tell investigators that she had seen Elizabeth and James walking together in the gardens, not like mistress and servant, but like two companions sharing private thoughts. Sarah Johnson, a kitchen maid, testified years later that she once entered the study without knocking and found them standing very near each other, James pulling his hand away from Elizabeth's arm in startled haste. "They jumped apart like they'd been burned," she said. "Mrs. Thornton sent me away quick, but her face was red, redder than I ever seen it." Time moved quietly on. Winter softened into spring, spring turned to summer, and the great house grew still. Elizabeth stopped attending dinners, teas, and church socials. Her cousin Thomas Montgomery visited in early 1838 and later wrote that he found her changed, distant yet strangely cheerful. She dressed simply now, spoke often of freedom and faith, and smiled in a way that unsettled him. He remembered that James had served them tea that day. "She said she had never felt more alive," he wrote. "There was something in her eyes I did not recognize, something like secret joy." Not long after that visit, a flurry of letters began to pass between William Thornton and his uncle, Judge Henry Thornton. In December 1838, William wrote that he had heard troubling reports about his stepmother's behavior and intended to visit her unannounced. Judge Henry urged caution. "There have been whispers," he warned. "It would be wise to address this privately before it becomes a matter of public scandal." William arrived at the plantation on January 15, 1839, during a cold, relentless rain. What happened that night has never been fully recorded. The next morning, the sheriff was summoned after a disturbance of serious nature. By noon, James Bennet had been arrested. The charges were vague and later dismissed, but the incident left a mark that could not be erased. Elizabeth was not arrested, yet church leaders quietly instructed her to refrain from attending services for a period of reflection. 6 weeks later, reflection turned to defiance. The Savannah Morning Republican published a new notice that stunned the entire city: the marriage of Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton and Mr. James Bennet. Somehow, Elizabeth had secured legal freedom papers for James, and the two had been married in a private ceremony conducted by Reverend John Baker, a Methodist minister known for his abolitionist leanings. The wedding took place not in a church, but in the parlor of the Thornton home, witnessed only by Grace, James's mother, and a visiting lawyer from Philadelphia named Samuel Cooper. Records show that Cooper stayed in Savannah only 2 nights before heading north, never to return. The reaction was swift and merciless. On April 5, 1839, the Savannah City Council called an emergency session to discuss what they called a moral crisis threatening the structure of our society. William Thornton filed a petition to have his stepmother declared mentally unfit, seeking to claim control of the estate. Judge Henry Thornton excused himself from the case due to family ties, but privately wrote to the governor, pleading for guidance. Meanwhile, the Montgomery family, once proud of Elizabeth, publicly disowned her. publishing statements in newspapers across Georgia and South Carolina declaring she was no longer recognized as kin. From that moment forward, pieces of the story began to vanish. Documents disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Letters were burned. It was as if the entire city had decided to erase the scandal from its memory, yet fragments remained. In 1954, during the renovation of a crumbling home on Broughton Street, a letter was discovered behind a fireplace brick. It was unsigned, written by someone who called himself a witness to infamy. The letter described what happened the week after the marriage. On the night of April 10th, 12 men rode out to the Thornton plantation. They carried torches and demanded that James Bennett come out and face justice. But it was Elizabeth who stepped onto the porch. She held a shotgun in her hands. "This is my home and my choice," she said. "Leave now or face what comes." The look in her eyes, according to the letter, made even the angriest men hesitate. They left that night, but returned 2 days later with the sheriff. When they entered the house, it was empty. The furniture was covered with white sheets, as though carefully packed away rather than abandoned in haste. In a small room off the library, James's study, there was nothing left at all. No papers, no books, no trace of the life that had filled it. Sarah Johnson, the former maid, would later say that Elizabeth had taught James to read and write in that room. "They cleared it out completely," she said. "Not a thing left to show what happened there." The disappearance of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett became what newspapers soon called the Great Savannah Mystery. Rewards were offered, rumors spread across the state. Some claimed the couple fled north with the help of abolitionists. Others whispered that they had drowned at sea. And there were those who believed their spirits still haunted the old plantation. Despite the searches, guarded ports, blocked roads, private detectives, no trace of them was ever found. They seemed to have vanished into the humid Georgia air. Still, there were rumors. A train conductor in Charleston who swore he saw a white woman and a well-dressed black man board a northbound train. A ship captain in Wilmington who claimed he'd carried a mixed-race couple to Boston. And later a banker in Montreal who said a woman resembling Elizabeth tried to withdraw money using papers signed by a lawyer named Samuel Cooper. As months passed, the scandal turned into legend. It became a cautionary tale whispered to young women in drawing rooms, a story of passion, ruin, and defiance. The Thornton estate fell into decay. William Thornton finally gained legal control in October 1839. Sold the property and never returned. Of the 46 enslaved people left behind, little was recorded. Some were sold to Alabama plantations. Grace, James's mother, was not among them. Her fate, like her son's, remains unknown. The story might have ended there, buried beneath layers of shame and silence, if not for what was found 5 years later. In 1844, when new owners began repairing the old Thornton home, workers found something hidden beneath the floorboards of the small study. Wrapped in oilcloth lay a leather-bound journal. It was turned over to local officials and eventually came into the possession of Judge Henry Thornton. He read it in a single sitting, and 3 weeks later, he was dead. Doctors said apoplexy, a sudden stroke brought on by shock or distress. The journal was never made public. His widow later said she burned it, calling it a dangerous thing that carried corruption. But before its destruction, the judge's clerk, a young man named Thomas Wilberforce, secretly copied several passages. Years later, in Boston, he shared them with a Harvard researcher. Those notes, rediscovered in 1958, revealed that the journal had belonged to Elizabeth Thornton herself. Its earliest pages dated back to 1822, the year Grace and her young son James arrived at the plantation. One passage stood out among the rest. Elizabeth had written, "The child shows great intelligence. I may indulge my curiosity too much, but there is something in his eyes, a sharpness, a quick mind that I have not seen in any other child, white or black. Today I showed him my book of pressed flowers, and he remembered every name after hearing it only once. Later pages spoke of Elizabeth's secret decision to teach him to read, even though her husband had strictly forbidden it. A would be furious if he ever found out. But what harm could come from learning? The boy absorbs every word I show him. He reminds me of myself when I was young, before they told me that a lady's lessons should be limited to manners and charm, not knowledge. As the years went by, her writing became more personal. A page dated 1830, when James was around 17, read, "I find myself waiting for him in the mornings, watching how the light touches his face as he works in the garden below my window. I tell myself it is pride, nothing more. But I fear it is something deeper, something I dare not name." By 1835, just before her husband's death, she wrote, "We spoke of poetry today. As he recited Byron, I no longer saw the boy I once taught, but the man he has become. I closed the book and sent him away. Later I cried, though I do not know why." The most revealing entries, according to the Harvard Notes, appeared after Richard Thornton's death. "With R gone, the house feels changed. Jay and I walked through the garden at dusk, speaking of the fields. For the first time I asked what he thought, not from politeness, but because I truly wanted to know. Our hands brushed while we looked at a damaged camellia bloom. Neither of us said a word, yet neither of us moved away. Later we stopped pretending. When the house grows quiet and the doors are locked, he comes to the library. We read and talk, and I feel seen in a way I never imagined possible. He understands my heart more deeply than anyone ever has. I have begun asking about laws in other states. There must be a place where we can live without fear." The final copied entry was dated March 30th, 1839, only days before their marriage announcement appeared in the paper. "Tomorrow everything changes. Sam Cooper has secured the papers. Once the ceremony is complete, we must leave at once. Jay fears for his mother, but she insists on staying for now to keep up appearances until we are settled. I have sewn what jewelry and money I could into our clothes. The northern friends Sam introduced me to have prepared safe houses along our route. I know the danger, but for the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own path." The Harvard researcher added a curious note. Wilberforce claimed that in 1852, while visiting Montreal, he met a woman he believed to be Elizabeth Thornton. She lived under another name in a quiet neighborhood of mixed families. When he approached her, she denied being Elizabeth, but invited him in for tea. During their talk, she spoke of poetry, specifically Byron, which reminded him of the journal. Before leaving, he noticed a portrait on her wall of a black man dressed formally. When he asked about it, she smiled and said, "My late husband. He passed 3 years ago." Wilberforce never officially reported the meeting. Over time, the Thornton scandal faded from memory, buried beneath the rising national tensions that would soon lead to war. The plantation changed ownership twice before it was mostly destroyed during Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. The land was later divided and developed. Today, a neighborhood stands where the old house once stood, and few living there know what history lies beneath their feet. The Thornton name survives only in a small side street near Abercorn and in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, where researchers sometimes stumble upon fragments of the story by chance. In 1957, during the construction of a shopping center near the old plantation site, workers unearthed a small metal box buried about 3 feet underground. Inside were a cameo brooch, a pressed camellia between glass, and a folded note tied with a lock of hair. The items were sent to the Georgia Historical Society, where they sat unrecorded until 1963. That year, Dr. Ellen Hammond studied them as part of her research into the Thornton mystery. She noted that the cameo matched one from Elizabeth Thornton's wedding records. The pressed flower was a rare kind of camellia bred on the plantation, and the hair seemed to come from two different people, intertwined together. Dr. Hammond never published her findings. Colleagues said she became obsessed, convinced that more evidence was hidden. In the spring of 1963, she traveled to Montreal to follow up on the Wilberforce story. She wrote to her department chair that she had made an important discovery and would return with proof that would change Georgia's history. 2 weeks later, her hotel room was found empty and her notes were missing. The only thing left behind was a single pressed camellia placed on her pillow. 3 days later, she was found in a hospital, confused and unable to recall what had happened or where her research had gone. After that, she abandoned the Thornton case and refused to speak of it again until her death in 1968. Now, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet exists somewhere between fact and legend. Some parts can be verified through court records, newspapers, and letters. Others remain uncertain, built from fragments, rumors, and quiet gaps in the record. What is known for certain is that in the spring of 1839, a wealthy white widow and a black man she once owned under Georgia law vanished together. Their disappearance shocked society, not only because of the broken racial boundaries, but because their closeness had clearly grown over years, perhaps even while her husband was still alive, inside a home that once symbolized Southern order itself. The true mystery is not only what became of them after they vanished, but what took place before. What happened in those still hours of teaching and learning, in whispered talks over books, in glances exchanged across rooms where others saw only mistress and servant. What words were spoken? What promises were made? And most troubling to those who later studied their story, how many other homes hid stories like theirs behind calm, respectable walls? How many lives crossed forbidden lines that society worked so hard to keep intact? After Dr. Hammond's death, a graduate student sorting through her things discovered a sealed envelope with a note requesting it not be opened until 50 years after her passing. The university administration, fearing legal complications, ignored her instructions and opened it in the presence of lawyers. A staff member who was there, but asked to remain anonymous when interviewed in 1972, claimed that the envelope contained a single sheet of paper. On it was an address in Montreal and the words, "They survived, they lived, their descendants walk among us still." The paper was reportedly taken by university officials and has never been made public. The address, according to the same witness, led to a cemetery. Even today, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet occasionally resurfaces, appearing in academic papers, in specialized studies of antebellum Southern society, and in quiet stories told during ghost tours of Savannah's historic district. Tour guides sometimes point to a house near Reynolds Square, not the original Thornton home, but one nearby, and claim that on certain nights, especially in April, a faint light can be seen drifting from one room to another, as if someone is searching for something or someone. Others have said they've heard a soft voice reciting poetry, though the words are never clear. These tales are, of course, tourist embellishments meant to enchant visitors. There is no solid proof behind them. But one thing remains beyond doubt. In 1839, Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet chose each other in a world that forbade such a choice. Rather than surrender to separation, they disappeared. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive, an attic trunk, or hidden beneath a modern building, there may still lie a clue to what happened after they vanished from written history and into legend. Until new evidence comes to light, their story remains one of Savannah's most haunting and thought-provoking chapters. Not because of ghosts or violence, but because it challenged the very structure of the world they lived in. It revealed how fragile those social rules truly were, and how far people were willing to go, either to defend them or to defy them. As one Harvard researcher who studied Wilberforce's notes once said, "The most unsettling thing about the Thornton case is not what it tells us about these two individuals, but what it suggests about the many others whose stories never reached paper, those whose courage went unseen, whose voices were silenced, whose lives were erased from memory." How many Elizabeth Thorntons and James Bennetts lived and died across the American South, their struggles buried with them? What does it reveal about a society that worked so hard to make sure such stories would never come to light? These questions still echo through Savannah's moss-draped squares, along the quiet riverbanks, and in the empty spaces between history's written lines. In 1972, during renovations of an old colonial post office building in Schenectady, New York, workers found a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside was a small leather pouch containing 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennett at an Albany address. The letters, dated between 1841 and 1843, were written in a graceful hand and signed only with the initial G. Historians later identified the writer as likely being Grace, James Bennett's mother, who was believed to have remained in Georgia after Elizabeth and James fled. The letters didn't mention Savannah or the scandal directly, but they referred to a shared acquaintance who had moved north and was eager for news from home. The most revealing line appeared in the 3rd letter, dated December 18, 1843. "Our mutual friend asks after you often. Things here have grown harder since your departure. The new master is cruel. Many have been sold away. I still keep the secret you entrusted to me, though there are those who continue to question me. The item you left in my care remains safe where we agreed. When my time comes, I hope to join you in a place where people may live by their hearts rather than by the commands of others." These letters were significant not just for what they said, but because they existed at all. They hinted that Grace might have escaped north after all, contrary to official records claiming she died on the Thornton plantation in 1840. More importantly, they suggested that communication had continued through a hidden network that allowed messages to travel between Georgia and New York, despite efforts to erase all traces of Elizabeth, James, and their past lives. More evidence of this secret network appeared in 1959 when a historian researching the Underground Railroad uncovered account books belonging to Samuel Cooper, the Philadelphia lawyer who had witnessed Elizabeth and James's marriage. These books, found in the archives of a Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania, contained coded entries later interpreted as financial records supporting several escape routes used by enslaved people seeking freedom. One entry, dated June 5, 1839, read, "Special arrangement for TNB package delivered safely to Montreal. Additional funds released as agreed for 5 years of protection and silence." Dr. Marcus Williams, who studied these ledgers before they were classified and restricted from public view in 1962, wrote in his private notes, "The Cooper accounts suggest that the Thornton-Bennett escape was not a sudden act of rebellion, but a carefully designed plan that may have taken years to complete. The level of funding, enough to secure 5 years of safety and secrecy, implies not only significant resources, but extraordinary preparation." One can only wonder when Elizabeth Thornton first began to plan her escape from Savannah society. Was it after her husband's death, or had she started long before? The question became even more fascinating in 1964, when construction workers tearing down an old rice mill near the original Thornton estate discovered a small hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a wooden chest containing what looked like teaching supplies, a primer, a slate, several pencils, and a copy of Byron's collected poems. Experts dated these objects to the 1820s or early 1830s, before Richard Thornton's death. But the most intriguing item was a small notebook filled with handwriting exercises, the same sentence written again and again in improving penmanship. I am James Bennet. I am a man. I have a mind. At the bottom of that page, in different handwriting believed to be Elizabeth's, were the words, "Excellent progress. You have earned your name today." That short note suggested that Elizabeth had secretly been teaching James while her husband was still alive. Records showed that the rice mill was rarely used after 1825, once newer machines were built closer to the main fields. This made it the perfect place for secret lessons, far enough from the main house to avoid notice, but not so far as to draw suspicion over Elizabeth's absence. What no one has ever been able to determine is when or how their relationship shifted from that of teacher and student into something deeper. No surviving documents confirm such a connection before Richard Thornton's death. Yet a letter Elizabeth wrote to her cousin Anne Montgomery on October 18, 1834, 2 years before she became a widow, hints at something hidden. "I live 2 lives now," she wrote, "one that the world sees, where I play my part as expected, and another made up of moments stolen from the day, conversations that must never be overheard, thoughts I dare not speak. It is in that hidden life that I feel most truly alive. Is it not strange to feel most real when one must hide the most?" The secret life Elizabeth described became much harder to keep after her husband's passing. As a widow, she faced greater attention, especially concerning how she managed the plantation and the people she now owned outright. Several accounts from that time noted clear changes in her behavior. Margaret Williams, a nearby neighbor who kept a private diary found in 1957, wrote in September 1836, "Visited Elizabeth Thornton 6 months after her husband's death. She seems different in a way I can't quite explain. There is a restless energy about her that doesn't match her mourning clothes." When I mentioned how difficult it must be to manage such a large estate alone, she smiled strangely and said, "I am not as alone as you might think. I left feeling uneasy, as though I had seen something I was not meant to see." As more people began noticing Elizabeth's unusual behavior, James Bennet's role within the household also began to change. Witnesses later said that by early 1838, James had taken on duties far beyond what was normal for someone in his position. The kitchen maid, Sarah Johnson, told investigators that he was now managing plantation accounts, meeting visitors when Elizabeth was unavailable, and even writing to merchants in Savannah on her behalf. "He sat at the master's desk," she said. "He used the master's pen, spoke with the master's confidence, and Mrs. Elizabeth, she only smiled like she knew exactly what she was doing. It all seemed the most natural thing in the world." This gradual change, this soft breaking of the strict social boundaries that ruled Southern life, could not continue forever without consequence. The turning point came with William Thornton's unexpected visit in January 1839. No one knows exactly what he saw, but in a letter he wrote to Judge Henry Thornton immediately after leaving the estate, he described it as a disturbance of the natural order so deep that I could not remain under that roof another hour without fearing I might lose control. He hinted that he had found Elizabeth and James in a situation that left no room for an innocent explanation, though he avoided clear details out of respect for the family's reputation. What followed after William's discovery set off a series of events that would end with Elizabeth and James's marriage and later their mysterious disappearance. Few people realized that in the 3 months between that visit and their wedding, Elizabeth began quietly selling off her property and moving her money. Records from the Bank of Savannah show that between January 20th and March 15th, 1839, she withdrew large sums, converting them into portable forms like banknotes and letters of credit. She also sold several pieces of jewelry through a broker in Charleston. as proven by a receipt found among Samuel Cooper's papers. Even more interesting, she transferred ownership of a small property she had inherited in Philadelphia to a company listing Cooper as its only trustee. These steps show that Elizabeth was not merely running away, she was preparing for a complete new life beyond Georgia. The careful legal work done through other people and across state borders proves she fully understood what lay ahead. She and James would not only need to escape, but also create new identities somewhere far from the reach of their past, somewhere they could live without fear or shame. The strongest evidence of these plans appears in a statement from 1841 by a former clerk at a Savannah print shop. During a court dispute over William Thornton's claim to his stepmother's estate, the clerk testified that in February 1839, a well-dressed black man, later identified as James Bennett, had ordered business cards and stationery for Mr. James Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices, with an address in Montreal. Bennett explained that he was arranging this for his employer, who planned to expand trade in the North. At the time, the clerk thought little of it, but later realized what it truly meant once the scandal became public. Those business cards were not just props. They revealed the life Elizabeth and James had imagined together, one where he would be not a servant, but a businessman, not property, but a respected merchant. Choosing Montreal was a wise decision. As part of British Canada, it stood far from American slave laws. Its diverse population offered a level of safety, and as a major trading city, a tea and spice business would appear perfectly natural. The details of their journey from Savannah to Montreal remain uncertain, though scattered evidence suggests they traveled by ship to Philadelphia, where Cooper sheltered them briefly and provided new identity papers. From there, they continued north through New York before crossing into Canada. Among Cooper's belongings was a receipt for passage on the schooner Mary Jane, sailing from Savannah to Philadelphia on April 12, 1839. It listed two passengers, Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, described as aunt and nephew on family business. What seems nearly certain is that by August of that year, someone matching Elizabeth's description attempted to access funds in Montreal. Later that same year, city directories listed a James Bennett importer with a small shop on Rue St. Paul and a residence on Rue Antoine. The following year's directory added a Mrs. Jane Bennett at the same address. No mention was made of their race or background. Life in Montreal would have presented different challenges. Though they escaped the danger of Southern law, they had to build believable lives. Elizabeth's accent, their manners, their appearance, all needed to match the roles they had chosen. Their business success depended as much on acting as on actual skill. From what remains, they seem to have managed well. Port of Montreal records show that Bennett's Tea and Spice Company maintained steady trade throughout the 1840s. Tax papers indicate gradual prosperity, and by 1845 they had moved to a larger shop. Church records from a small Methodist congregation mention regular attendance and donations from Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, described as a couple of mixed background, a vague description that discouraged curiosity. The most personal look at their Montreal life comes from the diary of a young woman named Marie Leblanc, who worked in their shop from 1843 to 1845. Found in 1966, her journal recorded her impressions. Madame Bennett speaks French with an American accent, she wrote, but tries very hard to improve. She is always graceful, even in simple dress, and treats everyone kindly, from wealthy customers to poor peddlers. Mr. Bennett runs the shop carefully. They seem quietly devoted to one another. They share looks when they think no one is watching, small signs of understanding that make me wish for the same someday. In another entry, Marie described an uneasy moment. A customer from Boston asked Mr. Bennett about his past. He said he had grown up in the South but preferred the air of Canada, both weather and society. The man then asked if Madame Bennet was of European descent. A silence filled the shop. Mr. Bennet smiled and said, "My wife and I have found that Montreal asks fewer questions, which is exactly why we chose it." The man soon left, but Madame Bennet's hands trembled as she arranged the tea canisters, though she pretended nothing had happened. That small moment revealed how fragile their safety truly was. Even in their new home, one curious visitor from the south could have destroyed the life they built. Perhaps that fear led them to sell the business in 1849 and move to a quieter town outside Montreal. The shop was sold to a French-Canadian trader, and their address soon disappeared from city directories. From then on, their trail grows thin. No record survives of James Bennet's supposed death from pneumonia around 1849, as later told by Thomas Wilberforce after meeting Elizabeth. Death records from that period were unreliable, especially outside major cities. What can be verified is that in 1852, a year Wilberforce claimed to have met her, a Mrs. Jane Bennet, widow, purchased a small house in St. Henry, then a separate town west of Montreal. The property remained in her name until 1867, when it passed to a Miss Grace Bennet, listed as her niece and sole heir. Grace's presence raises many questions. There is no record of Elizabeth and James ever having or adopting a child. Yet the name Grace matches that of James's mother. Could she have been his mother, somehow reunited with them? Or perhaps a daughter born to the couple and named after her grandmother? The latter seems more likely, supported by a church record noting the confirmation in 1860 of a Grace Bennet, age 14, placing her birth around 1846, 7 years after the flight from Savannah. If true, it means their story was not just one of forbidden love, but of a family built across the deepest barriers of race and class in 19th century America. Somewhere, descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet may still exist, unaware of the courage and hope that shaped their ancestors' lives. The last trace of Elizabeth appears in 1869, 30 years after her scandal shook Savannah. A notice in a Montreal newspaper announced the death of Mrs. Jane Bennet, formerly of the United States, aged 72. The short obituary said she was survived by her beloved granddaughter and remembered for her quiet strength, her love of poetry, and her belief that all souls are equal before God. She was buried in a small cemetery in Saint-Henri, in a grave she had purchased years earlier. Beside it lay another grave, unmarked except for the years 1822-1849, believed to mark James Bennet's life. In 1963, when Dr. Eleanor Hammond traveled to Montreal following Wilberforce's notes, she reportedly visited that same cemetery. Whatever she discovered there vanished along with her research papers during her mysterious 3-day disappearance. By 1970, the cemetery had been relocated for city expansion, and the graves were moved without markers, erasing the last physical link to their story. All that remains today are fragments scattered across archives in Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, and Quebec. Testimonies spoken long after the events, objects found under floorboards or behind walls, diary entries never meant for the public. From these pieces, we can trace the outline of something extraordinary, a quiet act of rebellion against the walls of race and status. What remains uncertain is not what Elizabeth and James did, but who they truly were to each other. When did teacher and student become equals? When did respect turn to love? What promises were whispered in those secret rooms? What gave them the courage to imagine a life that society said could not exist? These unanswered questions fill the gaps between the records. They echo through Savannah's history, unsettling its polished image of the Old South. The story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet offers no neat conclusion and no simple moral. It reminds us of the countless untold stories buried beneath official accounts, the quiet rebellions, the secret understandings, the hearts that refused to follow the lines drawn for them. As one Harvard researcher later wrote, "What makes the Thornton affair so haunting is not simply that it happened, but that it makes us wonder how many others did too." If a woman of Elizabeth's standing could risk everything for such a bond, how many others felt the same but lacked her courage or her means? The real history of human connection across the boundaries of class and color in America remains mostly unwritten, existing only in fragments, whispers, and silence. In 1969, the same year Dr. Hammond's sealed envelope was opened, an elderly woman visited the Georgia Historical Society, asking for records about the Thornton plantation. The archivist described her as well-dressed in her 70s, with light brown skin and gray eyes. She spent hours reading through documents and taking notes. When asked why she was so interested, she replied that she was tracing her family roots. As she left, she paused by the display case containing the cameo brooch and the pressed flower found in 1957. She stood quietly for a long time, then smiled, not sadly, but as though recalling something from long ago. She touched the glass gently and said, "Some stories are better left untold, but that doesn't make them any less true." She never returned, and her name was never recorded. Like so much of this story, she remains another fragment, another faint echo from a past that refuses to disappear. In the end, perhaps that is what makes the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet so powerful. The endurance of human connection, the refusal of love to obey the rules society builds around it. In a world that declared certain bonds impossible, Elizabeth and James created a small space for themselves, first in secret, then in exile, and finally in memory. Even now, the fragments they left behind still move us. In Savannah, on quiet April nights when the air is heavy with jasmine and memory, guides still point toward Reynolds Square and speak softly of the widow who defied her world. Some say they see lights in old windows, hear faint lines of poetry, or feel a chill in the warm air. They are just stories told to entertain visitors seeking a bit of mystery, but beneath them lies a deeper truth. The past is never as simple as we wish it were. Human hearts have always refused to be contained, and perhaps somewhere the descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet still walk among us, carrying within them a quiet legacy of courage and defiance that time itself could never erase. Peace.